Well, welcome to this Food Diversity Day session on bread baking and the diversity of grains. This is very exciting to be part of this day. Well, we all know the inadequacies of our bread system, the hybrid wheats grown for yield, the steel roller milling turned by the high speed, all based on the high-speed, additive-rich Chorleywood baking process, turning them into loaves that stand in for the staff of life for most people in Britain. What we don't know enough about are the revolutionary farmers, millers, researchers, and bakers who are building a new grain system from soil to loaf, using some of the tens of thousands of wheat varieties that came before the hybrids, before industrial farming. It's a revolution that's having an effect even on the centers of conventional plant breeding here, like the National Institute of Agricultural Botany, who are now working to breed the qualities of heritage varieties into new wheats. This is a movement that is rooted in diversity. We're using a diversity of grains developed over millennia to suit particular conditions, particular cultures, leads to a diversity of soils, of farming, of milling, of baking, of retailing, even, as we heard earlier from Tim Spector, to a diversity of microbes in our guts, the microbiome that leads to good health, both physical and mental. So, how can that diverse revolution become a bigger part of the mainstream? Well, today on this session, we have three people who are at the heart of the revolution. Their stories can show us the way ahead to richer, more localized, healthier ways of eating, where the staff of life really deserves that moniker. And the three people are Kimberly Bell, Fintan, Keenan, and Wingmon Cheung. And we'll begin with Kimberly Bell, who used to be the CEO of a building company. And she's the first person I ever met who made me understand that mantra of act local, think global. She set up the small food bakery in the centre of Nottingham, and she founded UK Grain Lab, which is an annual gathering of farmers, millers, plant breeders, bakers, cooks, scientists, and academics, promoting the growing and eating of non-commodity grains in the UK. So, Kim, I think of you as embodying diversity. Why did you stop being the CEO of a successful company and become a baker who, is part of this diversity revolution?
Well, the company that I helped or co-founded and helped to run was involved in fitting out shops for large blue chip clients, we would have called them. So you're talking about retailers like BP Oil, petrol stations, Starbucks, Sainsbury's, the likes of and what we were really good at was fitting out these really small supermarkets. So there was this whole trend that our company was kind of built on, really, of building these micro supermarkets on street corners, supposedly to serve local communities. And I guess there are many anecdotes I could give you as to why I didn't like it or why I wanted to do something different. But, one of the strong memories that I have is sitting in a planning meeting for how we were going to reconstruct a petrol station and learning that petrol station made all of its profit on crisps.
We seem to have lost Kim for a minute. Kim? We'll just hold on in the hope that we get her back. Otherwise, Fintan, I'm going to move on to you and then go back to Kim when the technological problems are fixed. Okay, let's while we're dealing with that, let's move on to you, Fintan. Fintan Keenan is Irish. He's a farmer and a miller, and he's working in Denmark, which he has done for a number of years, growing a wide range of heritage grains that are milled in the hybrid stone and roller mill that he designed. He designs mills, that's part of how he makes a living. And they produce a huge range of flours while retaining the whole grain. And that, in its turn, produces outstanding bread. Fintan, why, let's begin with the most basic question. Why in grains in bread, does diversity matter?
I think that the easiest solution for that is, or the easiest answer to that question is flavor, most and disease resistance in the field. When you have, when I first came to Denmark, which is almost 15 years ago, it was just so obvious to me looking at the conventional agricultural system here that monocropping, you know, there's maybe 2 different varieties of wheat grown over the majority of the land in Denmark. And it's just this blanket of mono wheat. And then I had the opportunity to start working, this is my 11th season of now, with the heritage grain. And the first day that I started working on a farm with somebody who specializes in heritage varieties of grain, that what struck me was there was bread baked and we were invited in to sit down and have coffee and bread. And the flavor just exploded in my mouth. And I was like, how come this has never, you know, I've never come across this before. And that is fundamental of why it's so necessary to have diversity in grains, so that we're looking at disease resistance, we're looking at crops that will handle extreme climates like severe droughts that we had last spring and we're having increasing numbers of. And then what we can see with the majority of the grains that I'm growing right now is that not only diversity in terms of different varieties, but diversity by using populations, which is what functions increasingly better every year in terms of yield, quality, disease resistance, and then also putting that together with polycropping, so growing pulses and legumes together with it. It's phenomenal, and this is the future. This is the direction that we need to be going in. I'm going to cut short there because I can see that Kimberly is back online again.
Well, I think let's continue with what you're going to say, and then we'll go back to Kimberly. We'll just alter the order in which we're doing things, so go back to the diversity and how you're growing with pulses, growing the wheat.
So even the farm that I started working on here 11 years ago, one thing that became really obvious was monocropping using heritage varieties. It's good because you've got the research of the grains. You can find out what works, what varieties are good for the climate that we're living in, what is good for quality, what's good for yield, etc. But it's still monocropping, regardless. You know, you've got individual lines in huge swaths of field. We're talking about tens of hectares here, but it's monocropping. And if we want to focus more on a regenerative approach to agriculture, we have to move away from that. And that is where bringing in other crops, because polyculture is what increases diversity in the field. It's increasing the quality of the crop that you're growing, not just of the pulses and legumes, but also the grains that you're putting in there as well. And you're sequestering a lot more carbon in the soil. So having this dynamic approach to agriculture is the direction that we need to move towards. So increase or decreasing tillage in the fields. I'm not saying that we need to move to completely no-till, because that's quite difficult as I'm experiencing right now, if you want to do it 100%. But diversity is the key. And diversity in the sense that we have populations of grains, not just monocrops of individual varieties, and then polycropping together, whether that's beans or peas or clover or any other mixture of things. But that's the direction that we need to be going in. And we can see from the results of trials that we've done here, it actually affects the flavor of the grain as well. So we're not just talking about increasing protein levels or falling number or yield. We're talking about creating a new system where we're focusing on flavor as well, increasing that by using polycropping, which is, yeah.
I think we might move back actually at this point to Kim, because I wanted to talk to her about what we call YQ grains. But Vincent, we'll come back to you in a minute. Kim, now that we've got you, you were saying that you fitted out these, I jump back, but you fitted out these supermarkets, and this is what, this led to your Damascene conversion.
Yeah, sorry about that. So as I said, there was many anecdotes, but if you add to it just sort of that thought experiment about how this convenience store runs entirely on selling crisps, and then I spent time working on another project with a major retailer to increase the size of the waste pipes from toilets and the way that toilet systems were made because our shits were getting bigger. And that was just like astonishing to me. Like, I just couldn't believe what we were actually doing. Like, what is happening here? And then a third thing happened which stays in my mind, where I was in a planning meeting with Morrison's supermarket. They were building a flagship store. We were talking about merchandising it and shelving, and they were fitting retina scanners to all of the shelves so that they could monitor how people were looking around their shop. And obviously that then fed back into a really complex database, and it allowed them to manipulate the stocking of the stores to make sure they sold us the things that they wanted. And that basically brought me to a position where I realized that everything was becoming so homogenized and controlled, but possibly not in our best interests. And I have always been very interested in food and wanted to start a food business. And it was with that backdrop. And from those things, I started to read widely and investigate what was going on here, and reading about the fact that we don't use very many potato varieties, for example. I had the opportunity to start Small Food Bakery in Nottingham, and I wanted it to be a food production space and a food retailer that really did the opposite of what I felt the status quo was or the mainstream was doing. And that's led me on this crazy journey over 8 years to try to ask myself the question, if you don't like the big food system, which to me is corporate monoculture, that's got kind of pan-global influence, dangerous concentrations of power in very few hands, and also, more importantly, perhaps, just a complete lack of flavor or nutrition, then the question I was asking myself was, if I don't like that system, how do I exit it, and how do I demonstrate something that looks differently at every kind of possible aspect, and just provide something for my community so they can eat well? So yeah, that's the backdrop to sort of many adventures, really. And one of the most significant was obviously asking myself what the most important and useful foods, bread, obviously, as you've said in the introduction, and then what does it mean to be a baker pushing against this system? And that led me right back to learning about farming systems and lots of things that Fintan had said. I've seen incredible examples of around the world, but it all feels very emergent and new, even though some of those are old technologies. But one of the huge penny drop moments for me was meeting Professor Martin Wolf at Wakelands Agroforestry, which in itself is an amazing research farm that demonstrates that abundance and efficiency don't come from monoculture. They come from all kinds of complexity and diversity muddling in together. I went there to learn about farming and thinking about, well, where would I want my wheat to be grown? But he blew my mind because he'd actually been creating a wheat seed that taught me that diversity goes, the principle of diversity as a useful one goes right back down to the genetics of the seed. And that was the beginning of the whole world opening up, really, in terms of changing the way that I baked, and also becoming part of an amazing network of people around the world who were also interested in these things.
So how would you answer that simple question? Why does diversity matter?
It's not a simple question. There's no simple answer. And I think one of the things that makes it endlessly fascinating, as demonstrated today by the incredible roll call of speakers, is that it means something different to everybody. And I think that's the nub of it for me, because the thing I hated most about the big food system, or continue to hate most about the big food system, or where I think it's letting us down, is that it concentrates power with very few. And those people are not making good decisions on our behalf either. So even at a really fundamental umbrella level, diversity to me is about more people being empowered and feeling like they've got agency over their food system, and then being able to contribute meaningfully. And I think humans are amazing and our brains are amazing, and we can solve any problems, but only if we use all the tools in the box and we let everybody have a say. And I guess that's like a fundamental belief that I hold, and being able to take that belief and build a business and essentially find myself meaningful employment under that banner was really important. But one of the things I found interesting is that learning about the seed and the farming systems and diversity principles in all of these areas of the food network, that the values can be extrapolated to everything. So even as a food retailer, I feel like, these things are relevant, and that learning about farming systems and polycropping and diversity in seeds has actually just made me, it was an imagination space to make me think differently about what it is to be a provider of food in a city, and how do we produce positive community and social networks. And there's a lot to it. So yeah, the answer is probably several books worth, but
well, Dan's written quite a good one. But explain a little more about YQ wheat, which you use a lot in your bakery.
Yeah, so when I went to meet Martin Wolf back in 2017, as I said, went to learn about farming, but he kind of wanted to tell me about this population wheat, he called it, called YQ. I don't even know if it was called YQ then. I think we may have nicknamed it later. But it was called the ORC Wakelands population, and it had been a project that Martin, who had been a plant breeder, had a career in plant breeding, used to work for the British Plant Breeding Institute. And he was interested in diversity as a tool for organic farmers to try to increase sort of ability, if you like, to make things more resilient for farmers who weren't using chemicals in the system. Beginning with mixing different wheat varieties in the field, so a form of polycropping, I suppose. And that led him to be curious about what would happen if we actually crossbreed many different varieties of wheat, so instead of mixing different plants in the field to gain resilience. Which I guess is like the old adage of hedging your bets, isn't it? If you've got like many different crops in a field, no matter what the climatic challenges are or the pest challenges are on any given year, one of them is probably going to work. Whereas in our modern kind of culture of farming, monocrops are kind of like a bit boom or bust. You either have a really good year or it might completely fail. And that's where the chemicals come in. So Martin was interested in, well, how can we create this kind of resilience and diversity in a more complex way? So he took 20 varieties of wheat, and with the help of the John Innes Centre and through the research group, the Organic Research Centre, they crossbred all of the 20 varieties every which way. I'm not very good at the maths on that, but that created a huge amount of new parent crosses, parent plants, sort of something in the region of 200 were taken forward. And then Martin decided that he was going to plant every single one of those new parents into Wakelands agroforestry, itself a diverse farming system, a very natural system, and just let them grow. And he wasn't going to apply any selection process. He wanted the farm to select the wheat. He wanted this amazing agroforestry system to be in dialogue with these seeds and kind of have a conversation and decide each year which ones should flourish. So he was coming at it from a farming perspective, a radical farming perspective, not a kind of end goal of make the perfect bread. But this blew my mind. And when I first arrived at Wakelands, he was in field trial year 17. So he'd been doing this for 17 years. Planting the seeds, saving the seeds, replanting the seeds, and just letting this population evolve. I thought there was so much beauty in that idea, and it really resonated with me. And I was really sad when Martin said, I've been trying to get a baker to work with this grain for years and no one will work with it, and I don't understand why. So I had to explain to him a bit about the artisan baking culture in the UK and how monocultural it was, and how everybody was kind of making the same bread, and it was quite fashion-led, and there was a lot of, I had to show him what a crumb shot was on Instagram, which was a revelation to him. And then I was like, because everyone wants to achieve this like high spec, perfect in their eyes bread, people aren't willing to take risks and to use new crops or different crops. Anyway, I said, I'll do it though. I said, I'm not a very good baker. I'm quite new to this, but let me have a go. And I took it on. So I guess like one thing Small Food is known for is being the bakery that bakes with YQ. But it was really the beginning of a much bigger story that led to the establishment of UK Grain Lab, because I wanted other bakers to hear from Martin about this amazing thing. And we've kind of built this network around the principles of diversity, which is what Martin believed in. And that's not to say, obviously, that YQ is some kind of super wheat. I love it. It's become part of my life and who I am and part of my baking practice. It's an amazing example of what can be done, but I think we need diversity at every level. So, you know, I'm just like really happy that I've got a wheat, and I want everyone to have their own YQ or their own thing that they have this relationship with, because it's made my life and job just so much more pleasurable.
Do you think, I mean, I'll put this to our other panelists, but has sourdough baking become less monocultural? I mean, has it changed? Are people willing now, bakers, artisan, I hate using that word, but craft bakers, have they become more adventurous?
I guess I'll jump in if I may. I think that we've definitely moved forward a lot, especially in the UK since Kim created UK Grain Lab. I think that really has sparked a lot of imagination across the UK, in myself as well. Actually, at the time when Kim had sort of started UK Grain Lab, I'd actually left the country because I was feeling a little disillusioned with using commodity white flour, and just wasn't sure how to move forward with it. And I left the UK for a couple of years and then came back. And during that time, the second UK Grain Lab took place, and I was able to attend that, and that really inspired me. And I think it inspired a lot of people. But having said that, I still think we have a long way to go. I think that a lot of bakeries still don't make it enough of an effort to diversify the grains that they're using. It's still sort of the base of that white commodity flour. And then, you know, maybe they're throwing in 20% of a locally grown grain or something that's coming from a smaller miller as a heritage variety. But I think that the network is growing, and in parts of the UK, it's much stronger and there's much more access available. And then in other parts of the UK, and I'm from the north, I would say that things are a little slower. I mean, there's Yorkshire Grain Alliance now, and I think they're sort of making pretty good groundwork. And also in Scotland, there's a network there, but because everyone's so far apart from each other, I think it's a much more difficult picture. Whereas I'm in the Southwest, and I feel extremely lucky to be part of the Southwest Grain Alliance, where there's a lot of support to use localized grain and to have direct relationships.
Wingmon, I think I have, because you've leapt in and interestingly answered that question, I think I need to introduce you to the audience. This is Wingmon Cheung, who is a baker, and she's a self-described food obsessive, working at her new bakery Cereal in Bath using organic heritage grains. And before that, she baked in Paris. And she spent a rich period, really interestingly, working with one of Britain's greatest cheesemakers, Martin Gott, in Cumbria. And he is the pioneer of making his own cheese starters. I mean, it's a remarkable way of making cheese. I mean, I feel like I'll come back to you in a minute, Fintan. But Wingmon, what effect did working with someone who's really interested in basic diversity in cheese, what effect did that have on you as a baker?
I think that it was quite eye-opening because, I love food in general. I've always been interested in food, but I didn't realize that, Martin was, the only person really, making cheese with a natural starter on scale in the UK. I didn't realize that, most of the cheesemakers are actually using a starter that's just purchased from a large scale organization. And I guess, equating that back to bread, it would be the equivalent of, most artisan bakeries just using yeast and then maybe there's only one bakery that's doing sourdough bread. So that's it was definitely very eye-opening, and I think really interesting working there. I saw sort of a lot of comparisons in the work of making bread in the cheese world, especially because I was making it with a natural starter, and there was some, it was volatile. It wasn't always a perfect product, but then I think that there's some, the human aspect to that is something that really resonated with me, because that's sort of what drew me to sourdough as well, that it's different. We could all have the same recipe and be making the same recipe in different parts of the world with different flour, or we could even use the same flour, but we would get a different result. And I think, that really, I took away quite a lot from that experience with Martin, and I was lucky enough to kind of spend a little time milking goats as well. So I just saw that whole process going through, and it wasn't an easy task to make cheese with a natural starter. So I definitely have a lot of admiration for Martin and his principles in sticking to using the natural starter.
Fintan, let's come back to you. I mean, you're describing, learning to value this diverse collection of heritage grains, but understanding that monocropping them wasn't the way forward. I mean, and Kim has just described what Martin Wolf developed at Wakelands. Tell us how you moved on from that understanding.
It was something that was just ingrained, and I knew that it was wrong, fundamentally wrong. I spent a couple of years in Australia back in the late 90s, and seeing huge wheat farms out there, and realizing that this is the opposite way that we need to be moving in terms of agriculture. And then when I started on my grain journey here with Heritage Varieties in Denmark, it very quickly became obvious that we needed a new solution. At the time, I was actually really busy learning the whole world of heritage grains, that I just kind of ignored it and focused on learning the craft of varieties and the qualities, etc. And through time of reading and listening to podcasts and watching webinars, and finding out that, the key to it is what's in under our feet. That is the key to it. And without that, we're not going to have any quality of anything. Doesn't matter what crop we're growing. So when you combine, quality populations of grains together with polycropping and soil health, then it's a win-win-win for everybody. But that's where we need to be focusing on, and that's when the penny really dropped for me. But in order for that to happen, there's a long chain of events, both before and after that have to swing together in order to be able to get a proper outcome. And that starts with supporting farmers. If we are focusing on commodity grains, and we're pressing the price of that grain from the farmer, then that's where we're getting off on the wrong foot all the time. So the only solution to this is building local networks. And those local networks have to have a local market. And that is the key role of the miller and the baker. This knowledge transfer has to come from the farmer to the miller to the baker, and then eventually to the consumer. I see a question in there. Somebody wants to know, how are they going to make a loaf more affordable when they can buy a loaf from the supermarket for 50p? But what's in the loaf from the supermarket? It's commodity wheat that there's almost no nutrition in. It's fresh air. And you're talking about oat and crumbs on Instagram. That's not the route that we need to be going. And if we want to make this more affordable, we have to build stronger and more regional networks, so that we're supporting local economies, because then it's a win-win for everybody. It comes down to economics in the end. You have to be able to create a livelihood for everybody, from the farmer the whole way to the consumer, so that money is staying in here, not going to farmers in Manitoba in Canada, or not going to shipping merchants that are transporting it across the Atlantic. That's where everything starts going bonkers.
In the first session, Tim Benton said that we need something beyond individual choice to change the food system. We need to develop agricultural incentives to get farmers to produce crops that are good for the planet and good for us. How do you do that in the wheat system, Kim? And then Fintan and then Wingman.
Well, that's a big question. The way I've seen it done successfully has been in our local network. And when I first started meeting with farmers, I realized that they're incredibly intelligent, like deeply intelligent, and dedicated to their work and their land. And they're also extremely responsive to good ideas. And they're actually in the Grain Lab network, some of the most responsive and kind of positive movers forward. And I realized quite quickly that the problem, as Fintan points out, I think, is the millers and the bakers need to create a market. And actually where I've seen really positive change is where a baker and a miller, or several bakers and a miller, has stepped forward and said, we'll be your market. And the farmers have really gone for it, because I think intuitively they know what they need to do. And the outcome has been like happiness. So if you talk to a lot of the farmers in the Grain Lab network, they'll be quick to tell you that they enjoy their work more and they feel valued in their community, and that they hadn't for a very long time. So yes, there may be loads of policy pushes and pulls and different strategies that we could overlay at government. But the only thing I've seen working so far has been our kind of grassroots movement, changing people's lives. I'm not sure if I could comment on a kind of like a bigger policy level. I'm sure there's loads of good ideas out there.
Fintan? Incentives do we need? I mean, you talked about, money not going to Manitoba farmers, but, that new study by Sustain, which, was based in the UK, about how much money farmers get. The Manitoba farmers are probably getting a tiny, tiny portion of whatever that 50p is being paid in the supermarket.
But I would agree with Kim, like I can see the results of when working with local farmers, making agreements so that you know exactly what field the grain is coming from. And this rapport that builds up between the farmer and the miller, and then the miller and the baker, job satisfaction, but also financial incentives for the farmers, so they're getting a higher value or a higher price for their crops, that they know exactly where it's going. And then they know to the mill, for example, and then they can relay the information to the farmer of what bakeries are using what flour. And if they want to go and get a loaf of their own grain from that baker, then it's just this closed loop system is what we need to be developing and building upon, so that everybody has satisfaction at the end of it, not just emotional and mental satisfaction, but also satisfaction in their pockets. Because we have to create a livelihood, and creating local livelihoods or local, I'm reluctant to use the word sustainable, but local communities where the value economically is thriving and diverse. That's the key to it. And as I said earlier on, building markets, but not just for grains, all the other crops that are in the rotation that need to build soil health in order to be able to get that one wheat crop. So there's many different aspects to this that we need to develop. And it comes back to what Kim said, that it's satisfaction, it's that feeling of happiness that everybody has in the chain, which is really important.
So, Wingman, is there a role for government for agricultural incentives, or can it be more ground up? Can it be people like you building local food systems?
I think that local food systems are incredibly important. I think we've based our bakery upon that, and very much the same principles as Kim when she opened the small food bakery. What I might add is that I don't think I'm well placed enough to sort of say what policy we need, but we definitely need some support from the government to continue making wider changes, because whilst we have very strong pockets of the grain network within the UK specifically, I think there are still parts of the UK where that network is lacking. that takes, you know, people sort of feeling galvanized enough. I mean, I remember when I was in the Lake District with Martin, actually, and he was on tenanted land, and they were just growing some barley for feed, and we were just sort of speaking about, you know, wouldn't it be great if you were able to, you know, stop that field from being sprayed as a barley monocrop and actually like grow some grain for somebody like me. But it you know, it wasn't a change that he would have been able to make, because he's a tenant on a farm where, you know, they specifically want that to happen. And also, you know, he's a cheesemaker, so it was a secondary thing. But we definitely need support from the government to give farmers more incentive to grow grains. But again, yes, I totally agree. It comes back to the bakers pushing that demand and sort of working alongside farmers. I'm very lucky that I've have a relationship with Rosie, who mills for me, and herself and a few other bakeries in the southwest. And she's on Gathelney Farm with an amazing farmer, Fred Price, who's transformed his farm over the last sort of 5 to 6 years, and, you know, is a very inspirational person, I think. But we need to build more of these relationships, and we need to make it viable. Like I think me and my partner, we very much focus on the fact that we want everybody in the chain to be paid what they should be paid. So, you know, we're willing to pay more for our flour than perhaps other bakeries would. And maybe that sort of makes us more fortunate in a way, but to me, I'm very principled in that, because I have to see that I'm supporting a farmer in working in an ecological way, in the way that we want them to work and then, you know, the mill is being paid the right amount for their work, and then we're able to sell that end product for a fair price as well, because, you know, I'm putting the labor into it. It's all very important. But I agree that, you know, it does create this great feeling when you know exactly who the people are who you're working with.
Kim, you've just not long ago come back from the Washington Grain Lab, and, you know, there are issues. I mean, you tell us about that, but you saw there some of that reflections on the cost. You know, I mean, people are, Wingmon is saying people are willing to pay more. She pays the farmers more. People are willing to pay more for the loaf. But, you know, we're in the middle of, you know, this horrible crisis of cost of living crisis, you know, people choosing between heating and eating. And that's, you know, not something that a bread system or a food system can solve. That's about poverty and the way that money is shared around. But what did you see in Washington that bore on this?
So I went to visit a group of researchers working under the banner of the Bred Lab at part of Washington State University, and they are plant breeders, but they are also a group that really take quite an anthropological view of plant breeding, and they consider literally all of the implications of their decision making and also the potential outputs of the plants that they're creating. And it's an amazing bank of diversity, and also new crops are coming out of there all the time. Went there because they had created a new population, cross-composite population wheat, similar to the YQ, in honor of Martin Wolf, who sadly died in 2019. And I wanted to go there and bake with it. I was so intrigued. But just walking their trial plots is an astonishing thing, because you just start to realize how diverse these plants are, and how, like, their genetics are so complex and intelligent, and how we should be a bit more humble in the way that we or revere them a little bit more. But one of the things that I was also very interested in is that the Bred Lab have launched a campaign called the Bred Lab Collective, where they are encouraging bakers around the world to take up the mantle of creating what they call an approachable loaf. So they've acknowledged that price is one issue, but there are also issues of style and accessibility around bread. Bread's so cultural. So it was about creating a bread that was accessible to a healthy bread that's accessible to the maximum people possible. And lots of bakers, you can go on their website, WSU Bread Lab, and look at the collective, and there are bakers from all over the world signed up, and you can find links to their individual solutions to this problem. But the idea was it was to be a whole grain, or as much whole grain as possible, sandwich loaf, shaped in a tin, sliced, possibly bagged, and it would compete with the supermarket loaf in style and would be price capped. Now, you can't really compete with the what they call bread in the supermarket made by these industrial manufacturers on price. But what I would like to say on price is that I price match all of my products to their equivalent in the supermarket, and I'm usually cheaper. So it's not so we need to just dispel this myth that the things that we're advocating for, the changes we're advocating for in farming and in more connected localized food systems will not make our food expensive. What makes it expensive is that we receive no subsidy or support, and we're a grassroots movement doing things because we want to. And I would love to see an economic study that proved that the amount of financial subsidy that gets chucked after this terrible food, it probably equates the difference in price between ours and theirs. I honestly think we offer incredible value. But yeah, my time at the Bread Lab was amazing. There are pockets of people all over the world thinking really deeply about these issues, and diversity is at the core of all of their thinking, like at every level, whether it's social or down to seed genetics. It's an absolute core principle.
Fintan, how do you address this question of cost? You know, I mean, you've mentioned, you know, the money going to Manitoba farmers, but when people say to you, yes, but you're producing something, you know, you have all this diversity, but, you know, it's too costly for most people.
Good question. With my flour that I'm making, I'm definitely at the higher end of the scale in terms of pricing. And I have set that price so that I can transfer a proper price per kilo of grain back to the farmer. I'm trying to relay the information about that grain and about the quality of the flour that I'm producing to the bakers in order that they can transfer that knowledge to the consumers. But as soon as they start baking and selling the bread, it sells itself. So the cost of the bread is not a huge issue. But what I do notice is that, as this is something that Wing Mon said earlier on, that some bakeries are taking maybe 60% of commodity flour and then blending in X amount of my flour into it to give it that flavor. So that's where the cost cutting starts coming in the loaves of bread, so that they can make what you can call like a hipster approachable loaf, Kim, if it makes sense, that people have access to. But one thing, you know, this argument that people are saying that they can't afford to have, or they can't afford to buy a loaf from, you know, a really good artisan baker. They can still afford to buy the kilo of flour and bake at home. And one thing that I've noticed since I started milling myself and selling my own flour is those people that have come to me and bought a bag of flour and went home and baked with it themselves, they're constantly returning, because they've realized that this is something exceptional that you can't get in a supermarket for, you know, 50p for a kilo or whatever it is. And in order to pay for that quality, they're going to have to pay that little bit extra, but they're getting the return on it in terms of flavor and nutrition. So if people that kind of have never really thought outside the box that flour could be anyway different in flavor, in style, in texture, all of a sudden are waking up to realizing that actually this is something that is profound, because it's supporting the local community in terms of the farmers, it's supporting the mill, and then they have the opportunity to bake with this. And it may not be sourdough loaf, it could be just pancakes that they're making, or cookies, or buns, or whatever. But it's something that's completely different. And that, when you do that, when you do home baking, it becomes accessible. Yes, they may not be able to go and pay £5 or £6 for a loaf of bread from the bakery, but they can bake it at home. So that's one way of tackling the cost of what people see as inaccessible breads.
One last question, because we're almost on time, but Wingmon, when I was talking to Kim before we started the session, she was saying you were the great white hope, the young baker who's going to show the way in the UK. What do you hope to achieve through your new bakery, Cereal, in Bath? And you have to do this in 1 minute.
I just hope that people become more engaged with what they're eating. And this also goes back to what Fintan was saying at the beginning about flavor. We don't necessarily, we do talk about the grains that we use, but an important thing to me, I think, is, just for a general person walking into the bakery who doesn't necessarily know anything about, who we are, if they come in and they taste something and they really think, oh, wow, this is so flavorful. What is it? And, just sparking that conversation through flavor, I think is really important. And we are 100% whole grain bakery. So, and I strongly stand by that, because I just think that there's more flavor, more nutrition. To use that word sustainable, it is more sustainable because we're not wasting any of that precious grain. And I hope that people can come and sort of, taste the difference, to use a supermarket terminology, but it's quite, I think that you can taste the difference.
Well, thank you all. I mean, what we've all agreed is that taste and flavor and pleasure are going to be the drivers of this change, along with based on diversity or rooted in diversity. Thank you all very much, Fintan, Keenan, Wingmon, Cheung, and Kimberly Bell. You were all marvelous. And honestly, the conversation that's going on the webinar chat is astounding. Anyway, there's lots more good sessions coming up. Thank you all very, very much indeed.